I'll take you home. A loner engineer rescues a mother of 5 on a frozen colony, love against the ion storm. Welcome to Sci-Fi Nebula, where the farthest edges of space are closer to the human heart than they look. Tonight, we travel to Wyoming-λ, a knife-cold colony world adrift on the rim of the spiral arm, where ion storms turn daylight into white noise and good people keep their heads down to survive. A man named Cal Turner, an engineer who once lost everything to a rushing breath of vacuum, will make a choice that changes 6 lives. A woman named Mara, scarred by a family that worships control more than love, will stand on a landing pad with 5 newborn daughters and no one coming back. He will say 7 quiet words, "I'll take you home. Come with me." That's where our story begins, not with a battle fleet or a destiny foretold, but with a door held open in the storm. We'll follow them from a deserted landing pad to a heat-humming geothermal dome, through town gossip and family threats, through law and fear and the brittle edges of hope. And somewhere between a 3D printed cradle and a repaired airlock hinge, you might find what we came for: humanity, stubborn and bright as a coal that refuses to go out. Settle in. Keep one hand on the rail, ion weather is mischief with teeth, and let's step into the white. Chapter 1, The Whiteout and the 7 Words. Snow on Wyoming-λ doesn't fall, it strafes, microscopic ice dust sandblasted by magnetic tantrums until it flays paint and patience alike. The Ridge Hollow landing pad sat in that white roar like an old tooth. The shuttle had departed minutes ago, leaving a contrail of steam and boredom, and then even that was gone. On a steel bench that hadn't held warmth since summer 3 years prior, Mara Harlo held 5 newborn daughters under a single thermal blanket whose best days were behind it. Her lips were split, one cheek wore the violet echo of a hand that liked to be heard. There was a satchel at her feet with nothing in it that mattered to anyone cruel. She had been told to wait. Men who wore her surname like a badge said they would return. She knew they would not. Not with 5 girls. Not after the shouting, the slicing shame of being paraded out of a habitat by people who said blood was everything and meant it like a verdict. A crawler rolled out of the storm, treads whispering over ice. It was nothing much: 20-year frame, a cab that had seen better seals, a geothermal preheater wired in with stubborn competence. The man who climbed down looked like anyone you'd pass tools to without asking his life story: late 30s, shoulders like load-bearing members, hair too short to tangle in a fan. He wore a jacket patched at the elbow with careful stitches. He saw her. Stopped. Took the scene in with a glance that broke nothing open and didn't make it worse. "Station master around?" he asked the wind, because there was no one else to ask. Mara tightened the blanket. One tiny fist found freedom and unfurled into the cold, reaching for nothing. "They said they'd come back," she said. "They won't." The man didn't answer fast. The storm filled the space for both of them, the hiss of driven ice, the deep groan of metal remembering summers. He scanned the pad, the vending shack, the silent comms pole. Nothing alive but them. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara." She hesitated, swallowed, and left the rest unsaid. Names could be ropes or knives, and here, everything cut. He unzipped his jacket as if peeling away a skin he didn't need. Underneath, he wore a sleeveless thermal lined with radiant fibers. The jacket itself held the faint whir of micro-heaters, a patchwork of stitched repairs like constellations. He set it around her shoulders in one motion that could have been a question if it came with words. She startled as the warmth climbed her collarbones. Her arms tightened around the blanket, 5 small mouths quieted a fraction, accepting the idea that the universe might be kind for a minute. "They don't want girls," she said to the jacket as much as to him. "5's a curse." His gaze slid to the black eye and away again, not pretending not to see, not poking at it. He exhaled once, a white plume. "You'll freeze if you sit here." "They told me to wait." Maybe they did. He considered the far side of the pad, where the drift curled up like a breaking wave. He considered the woman whose jaw was set as if it had been broken into that position. He considered 5 lives too new to have a word like curse anywhere near them. He nodded toward the crawler. I've got heat. Food. A roof that doesn't argue with the wind. He met her eyes for the first time. His were the gray-blue of old wells. I'll take you home. She flinched as if bracing for the price that always followed offers. When none came, suspicion and relief fought in her face, neither winning. Why? The word was small and fierce. Because it's cold, he said. Because you have 5 reasons. There wasn't room for debate. The weather closed the circle. He lifted the satchel, there was no weight in it worth mentioning, and opened the crawler's rear hatch to reveal a portable nursery module Cal had once printed in a fit of optimism and never used. He adjusted the heat sinks, coaxed the amber lights to life, and held out his hands in a way that made choice possible. She didn't give him all 5 at once. She surrendered one, watched him nestle the baby into the module, adjust the straps so they held and did not choke. He reached for the next with a patience that wasn't slow. By the time he secured the 5th, the wind had turned a sharper pitch. Time to go. He helped her up. He didn't steer or hurry. Inside the cab, the heater coughed and then remembered its purpose. The door thunked shut. The world outside was white noise and blind speed. I'm Cal, he said as the crawler nosed into the storm track. Cal Turner. Mara watched the readout where the cabin heat climbed in honest, incremental degrees. She watched his hands on the controls, steady as if the wheel were listening. She watched the babies breathe, 5 small tides rising and falling in a light amber glow. They left the landing pad behind, a small dark square that swallowed secrets for a living. The crawler dug into the drift and then swam through it like a patient animal. Somewhere in the back, a milk bottle clinked against another. Cal's jacket warmed her spine, her cheek throbbed in a slower rhythm. He did not fill the cab with questions. He didn't ask how a woman ends up abandoned in a storm with 5 newborns. He didn't ask who did the bruising. He drove. They passed the edge of Ridge Hollow, a string of lights under snow roofs, a cantina with a slow neon flicker, the supply shop that smelled like kerosene and printed parts. 2 men were smoking under a windbreak. One of them smiled like a strike of chalk. Cal's jaw tightened, his hands stayed level. Breathe, he said softly as the crawler took a rut too fast. It took Mara a moment to realize he wasn't telling himself. By the time they reached the black bulge of Cal's geothermal dome, dusk had folded into the storm, leaving only the crawler's lamps and the quick pulse of the airlock status. Cal braked, swung out, and lifted her down into the driftless lee. She barely weighed anything more than the blanket and 5 invisible anchors. Door might bite, he warned, palming the panel. The lock cycled, warm air muscled out into the cold. The smell of pine biopellets and iron and soup was so sudden she nearly cried. Inside, the hab's heart beat in the low hum of the microreactor. A pot rattled on a trivet. A 3D printer sat in the corner with its lid cracked, as if it had been halfway through making a spoon when the world outside made a sound it wanted to hear. Cal set the portable nursery on the table and thumbed the heater to nest. The amber glow turned honey gold. The babies sighed, all the same person and entirely themselves. He ladled soup into a bowl. Set it down without commentary. Tuned the environmental panel a notch toward humid. Checked the reaction mass on the reactor out of habit. Mara stood beside the table until her knees trembled. The chair found her before the floor did. She ate without asking if she was allowed, because the way the bowl sat there said you do. Cal didn't watch her. He found a loose hinge in the secondary air seal, took the driver from a peg, and turned a screw with the kind of attention that leaves people alone while staying nearby. The storm threw itself at the dome with less and less conviction as the hab learned its angles. Heat seeped into bones that had only learned cold. When the bowl was empty, Mara wiped her mouth on the back of her hand and then on a towel because the habit still felt like stealing. I can work, she said, as if bracing for someone to disagree. I know, Cal said, not looking up. There's always work. He banked the reactor for night. He checked the door latch twice. He placed a folded blanket on the lower bunk and climbed the ladder to the loft without asking whether she preferred it that way. From above, he heard 5 breaths make one soft sound and then, long seconds later, the smaller sound of a woman remembering how to let air all the way out. Outside, the white kept falling. Inside, heat tapped the radiators with a tiny, patient song. Chapter 2, The Dome, the Quiet, the First Warmth. Morning on Wyoming-λ does not so much arrive as permit itself. The storm had scraped the sky clean, leaving the light thin as a blade. Inside Cal's dome, warmth held in the way a promise does when no one comes to collect. Mara had slept in fragments, which were luxuries compared to the rags she'd lived on for weeks. The 5 were arrayed in the portable nursery, each wrapped burrito-tight in a blanket she trimmed from a salvaged thermal sheet while the soup cooled. Their breaths moved in sequenced waves, each one a counted miracle. Her body ached as if someone had removed it and returned it with extra gravity. Cal moved through the hab with a quiet that was not secrecy, it was respect. He had a way of letting floorboards be quiet and hinges understand what they were for. He brought the reactor up one notch, checked the humidity scrubbers, adjusted the protein culture bubbling in a corner like a friendly swamp. He ladled another bowl without announcing it and left it on the table to steam its opinion into the air. Mara watched the bowl as if expecting a trapdoor beneath it. Hunger was a sly animal, it made rules where none existed. After a minute, she stood and eased into the chair. The first spoonful was a small holy thing. By the third, her shoulders dropped a centimeter, the tremor in her fingers receded to the borderlands. Cal cleaned the air intake mesh with a toothbrush someone had once used for teeth. Repairs were love letters written in stoic Morse. He said nothing about the way she ate, she said nothing about the way he didn't look. When the bowl was empty, Mara set it down with care, as if it might break from gratitude. She rearranged the babies into a makeshift nest of folded blankets near the warm bulkhead, 5 human satellites around a small sun. One wrap had lost its tie. She tore a straight strip from her underskirt, twisted, tied, tested the knot like a sailor. Cal noticed, he did not narrate it. In his world, attention and commentary had gotten divorced a long time ago. The dome was one room with ambitions, a food corner, a workbench, a bunk under the loft, a hygiene stall, a printer that would do as told if the filament never ran out. The outside hatch had a lip where the snow tried and failed to get clever. Out beyond that, the fuel cache sulked under a tarp and a set of flaps he'd rigged out of sheer stubbornness. Mara kept looking at the door as if truth might knock. Hands can learn to be still, eyes take longer. By mid-morning, she rolled her sleeves and took the pump handle at the basin. It resisted in the way of equipment that secretly prefers one owner. Cal stepped in, set a rhythm, slow, firm, unarguable, and the water ran. She didn't say thank you. She didn't move her elbow away. I'm not here to be kept, she said, jaw set, as if the words could bruise her in reverse if she flinched. I know, he said. And I don't keep people. Her mouth twitched at that, something like almost laughter or almost pain. She washed the bowl, then another, then the ladle, because the act was both useful and a way to be a person again. By the time the last dish dried itself on the rack, a baby woke and scolded the room for being late with a meal. Mara scooped her, sure-handed, and the scolding dissolved into the industry of living. Cal went to the bench and mended a cracked tool handle with a 3D, printed spline and 2 screws a size he had exactly 3 of. The printer, sulking the way machines sulk when they think they know better, slowly nursed a spoon into existence layer by stubborn layer. He checked the seals on the secondary hatch. He glanced at the window, where the light was the kind that lies. When the babies slept again, Mara took Cal's work jacket from a peg. The elbow patch he'd sewn was beautiful in the way necessity gets when it wants to be. But a seam at the shoulder had failed. She threaded a needle with the gray filament thread she found in a drawer, put in the first stitch like a woman testing a territory, and then let her hands remember her mother's hands. "You don't have to," Cal said without looking away from the tool handle. "It was hanging there," she said. "Couldn't leave it." He nodded once, as if that was the most reasonable cosmology he'd heard this month. Outside, the wind ratcheted up a tone and then back down, like a throat clearing. Cal took a read on the magnetic index and didn't love the numbers. Ion weather was coming, nothing murderous, just the ordinary disrespect of the planet pretending to be alive. He gathered a polyfuel bundle, snapped it into the heater, checked his inventory of reactor pellets. He made a note to print more vent flanges, then remembered he'd been making that note for 6 months. Mara stood at the window for the first time and didn't hide it. The world outside was white to the horizon except where black rocks shouldered through like old whales. The town sat 5 kilometers east, a crooked string of roofs and good intentions. She could feel the eyes in that town without needing to see any of them. The memory of Roy's smile, the chalk strike under the windbreak, came back with a smell she didn't intend to keep. "You'll need cloth, milk, salt," Cal said. It wasn't a question, it was a weather report. "I'll go," she said immediately, then surprised herself by softening it. "If that's all right." "It is," he said, and let the word sit. They took the crawler after midday when the light admitted it was present. Cal strapped the portable nursery in with webbing that had held mining gear last year. Mara sat beside it and kept count of little breaths until counting became mother math and not fear. Ridge Hollow pretended it wasn't a town. 3 long structures, 2 short, a yard full of things that thought they were useful and were right on alternate Thursdays. The cantina smelled of heat and bad decisions. The supplies shop had a bell with a voice. People looked up. That was the way of places with walls. Cal braked in the lee of the shop. He stepped down, offered his hand like a bridge. Mara took it because the gap was too far to jump while carrying 5 lives in her chest. Eyes found them. They always do. Roy leaned against a post with a toothpick as if he'd invented wood. "Look at Turner," he said to the man next to him, not bothering to swallow his grin. "Rescuing strays." Cal's jaw flexed once. He didn't answer because words are a currency, and he didn't do business with men like Roy. Inside, the shop was a museum of survival: filament spools, sealant, lamp oil, dried apples, a rack of printed fittings that hadn't sold yet. Clara May manned the counter like a queen who had no patience for thrones. Her hair was pinned back with a clip that had outlived 3 worlds. Cal ordered lamp oil and oats because even in space, breakfast happens. Mara found the cloth rack and laid her fingers along a length of sturdy muslin. She saw diapers in it. She saw clean edges where there had been fray. She did not see curses anywhere in the weave. Clara drifted over without drifting. She slid a small packet of needles and filament thread into the fold of the muslin as if losing track of inventory was a sin she'd take on herself. "You'll mend more than clothes here," she murmured, eyes soft and sharp at once. "Thank you," Mara said, the words gratefully unadorned. They paid. Outside, the wind had cooled to opinion. Roy was gone, opinions remain. On the ride back, the crawler talked in familiar clunks. The nursery hummed a lullaby it had not been programmed to sing. Mara sat with her hands clasped and her eyes on the horizon where the snow met the sky with no seam at all. "They don't like me," she said finally, as if the sentence had been waiting in her mouth for years to choose a day. "They don't know you," Cal said. "They don't want to." He flicked the steering bar lightly, letting the crawler correct. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't tell her it didn't matter. He watched the road that never was and kept them on it. By the time the dome took them back in, the light had aged into evening. Cal set down the hinges he'd bought and ran his thumb across the seam she'd mended in his jacket, neat, deliberate, the work of someone who had mended more than fabric. They ate. Tangle soup with molasses so thin it just remembered sweetness. The 5 woke on rotation, a relay race of survival. Cal took the smallest, awkward at first, then adjusting with a tenderness that worked without declaring itself. Sable, Mara decided privately, because she would not allow the word last to land on any of them. Later, Cal took a plank and a plan to the bench. The printer obliged with a series of curved components that could become a cradle if he willed it. The hab filled with small honest noises, the click of a needle through cloth, the whir step of the printer head, the murmur of two people learning where the other kept their silences. Storm coming? Mara asked without looking up. Feels like it, Cal said. Winds shifting. I hate storms. They pass, he said. He did not say that sometimes they passed through you and stayed. He checked the latch again that night and again after that. Mara noticed. She tucked the blanket higher over Iris. She'd decided that one was Iris because her eyes had a serious blue. She didn't ask who he expected. She had been taught what to expect, and it had learned her face too well. When Cal climbed to the loft, the dome settled into the sweet weight of a place holding the line. The ion hiss outside made the windows think about complaining and then reconsider. The babies slept. For a full minute, so did the fear. Mara lay on the lower bunk with 4 tiny suns arranged around her and one asleep against her shoulder. The rafters glowed faintly with reactor light. The word home hovered in the air, fragile as a bubble and just as round. She refused to name it. Not yet. But when the heater ticked like a satisfied animal and the storm said something rude to the chimney, she turned her head toward the loft ladder and wondered what it might mean that the storms she feared were not only outside. Chapter 3, Ridge Hollow, A Town with Eyes. Ridge Hollow was never big enough to be cruel in private. Gossip had to huddle close to stay warm, which meant it always found company. The day after the storm had scraped the sky to a hard blue, Cal checked the magnetic index twice and listened to the wind the way a mechanic listens to a motor he rebuilt under pressure. He didn't like the tone, thin at the edges, brittle in the center. But needs were needs, and 5 newborns multiplied them by 5. He strapped the portable nursery back into the crawler and looked to Mara. You don't have to go, he said. I do. She wrapped the jacket he'd given her tight, as if the lining were a promise and not just microheaters and good stitching. Milk cultures. Salt. Cloth. And I want to stand up in that town. He nodded once, the way he nodded at weather he couldn't change but could navigate. The crawler's treads read the road by memory. Snow threw light back into their faces until it felt like driving through a mirror. The 5 slept, the nursery's amber nest mode holding their tiny planets in orbit. Mara watched them and then the horizon, as if daring either to flinch. Ridge Hollow greeted them the way Ridge Hollow greeted everyone, by counting. Heads turned from behind polyglass windows. A pair of miners paused mid-lift over at the ore yard, mussels frosting in the air. At the cantina, a neon sign decided to function just long enough to underline the joke no one had told out loud. Afternoon, Turner, someone called, the tone wearing friendliness like a borrowed hat. Cal parked in the lee of Clara May's Supply and Fabrication. He stepped down, then offered Mara his hand the same as before, like a bridge, not a chain. She took it because there was a gap, not because she couldn't jump. Inside, the shop smelled like lamp oil, filament, and stubborn fruit, dried apples that refused to admit they'd left the tree. Clara was where Clara always was, which was anywhere she needed to be before anyone said her name. Her hair had tried to escape its clip and failed with dignity. 2 days in a row, she said, smiling with her eyes and not her mouth. You aiming to spend your children's inheritance? We're a little short on inheritances, Cal said. Long on children. Mara drifted toward the cloth bolts and ran her fingers along a roll of muslin she hadn't bought yesterday because she was still learning which choices were allowed. The fabric didn't care who she was. That felt like a kindness. Clara joined her without fuss. If you're making diapers, try the heavier weave. Lighter tears under a fast hand. Mara glanced up, surprised at the way the advice slid in without asking for her story. Thank you. Clara pawned a packet as if it had been there by accident and tucked it into the fabric fold. Extra filament thread, she murmured. Bites less than wire in cold hands. At the counter, Cal paid for refined salt, milk culture ampoules, sealant, and a box of vent tabs he'd been telling himself he could do without. He left coins for things that weren't on the list because there are taxes that never make the ledger. They were almost clear when a voice hooked them from the doorway. Turner. Roy lounged against the jam like it owed him money. The toothpick made a show of being a personality trait. "You starting a home for wayward genetics?" he asked, eyes sliding to Mara and then to the nursery cradled in the crawler, "or did you forget how to count?" Cal's jaw twitched once. "You need something, Roy?" "Just thought I'd say hi." Heard a Harlo shuttle ping the ridge net. Family's real torn up. Looking to correct an error. Mara's grip on the muslin tightened until the skin across her knuckles thinned. Cal's body didn't move, but the space he took up changed. "Tell whoever told you," Cal said, voice as flat as a properly machined edge, "that any error they left at the landing pad is no longer theirs to correct." Roy chewed on that, found no flavor, and spit the toothpick into the snow like punctuation. "We'll see what the law says." "The law says a lot of things," Clara said from behind her counter, as if reciting inventory. "Some of them even true." Roy's eyes flicked to her, then away. "There are people you don't pick at in a town that knows how many screws it has." Cal didn't look back as he helped Mara into the crawler. He didn't raise his voice when he said, "Door." She pulled it shut hard enough to make the seal sigh. They drove in a quiet that was not silence. After a while, Mara said, "He knows." "He guesses," Cal said. Guessing loud is a trick people like Roy think is a skill. "They'll come," she said, watching the sky where the color thinned toward nothing. "They might," he said. "But not today if the index keeps climbing." Back at the dome, they stored the salt and ampoules like treasure and used them like tools. Mara mixed a batch of formula with the lazy confidence of a woman whose hands had never failed her even when everything else had. Cal tuned the air exchanger until it hummed a note he trusted. When the babies slept, Mara sat with the muslin and the filament thread, and the needle moved in steady arcs. Cal took a plank to the bench and sketched a curve with a carpenter's pencil he'd sharpened with a knife because he liked the grain you got that way. He didn't say cradle. He didn't need to. The printer's nozzle warmed in anticipation. "Thank you," Mara said, eyes on her stitch, voice on something larger. "For what?" "For saying we in town." He thought about pretending he didn't know what she meant. He didn't. "It's easier to stand in wind if you stand too wide." She smiled then, small, private, like a door opening 4 degrees to admit a sliver of sun. By evening, the sky had started to glitter with ion scrapings. Cal stepped outside to check the fuel cache and came back in with his face set to storm. He checked the door latch again, then the inner seal because checking is a love language some men speak better than any other. Mara noticed, the way she noticed everything, she filed it beside the stitches and the silence and the bowl that appeared when hunger did. The dome breathed them to sleep while outside, the world made plans. When the lights dimmed to night mode, the 5 slept on, oblivious to weather, politics, and the geometry of hearts learning to share a roof. Mara watched the ladder to the loft as if she could see through its rungs to the man who had chosen a sentence and then lived it. "I'll take you home." Words are cheap everywhere. It's how you carry them that costs. Sleep took her cleanly for once, and the dome kept the watch. Chapter 4, Ion in the Veins, Fire in the Walls. The morning came with the taste of metal in the air, the way it does when the magnetosphere is about to throw a mood. Cal was at the panel before the heat cycle finished its stretch, fingers walking the indices, eyes narrowing not with fear but with arithmetic. "Bad?" Mara asked, already notching the blankets tighter in the baby's nest by habit, not panic. "Not the worst," he said. "But the wind's going to talk like it knows us." He set the polyfuel bundles within arm's reach. He checked the reactor and then did it again with a different expression. He slid the safety shroud into place over the printer and cancelled the job half-shaped on the platform with a reluctance he didn't bother to hide. Mara pulled on the jacket and tied her hair with a strip of muslin that matched nothing and fixed everything. "What do you need?" "Inside. Don't let anyone open that door who isn't me." He pointed at the inner lock, then at the override. "If it sticks, kick it here. The trick is to be meaner than a design flaw." "And outside?" He smiled without teeth. "I don't take volunteers for outside." "Too late," she said. "You didn't keep me. I stayed." He didn't argue in the pointless way. He handed her a mask with a filter that had one more storm in it if no one breathed too deep. "If I say inside, you go inside. If I say the babies are hungry, you go faster," she said, fastening the strap. The bargain hung between them without wobble. They stepped into the lock and let it breathe them out. The storm hadn't started, the air did that waiting thing that puts a crease in the sky. They worked quickly, in the choreography of people who are both sure of themselves and newly careful of each other. Cal checked the antenna anchors, Mara hauled the vent flags into their storm position and locked them with the heel of her hand. He braced the fuel tarp, she latched the tool bin that had lied about latching since last winter. "Back in," he said as the first ion hiss licked the edge of the world. They cycled through and leaned their backs against the inner door together as if there were something to push. Sometimes there is. Sometimes there isn't. The habit stays useful either way. The wind arrived like a rumor, then like a law. The dome answered with the confidence of a thing that had survived enough to have an attitude. Metal sang in low notes. The air exchanger took a hit and kept its pitch. Mara settled on the lower bunk with 2 babies at her breast and 3 in the amber glow at her elbow. Cal set a chair near the panel and watched numbers crawl, making small adjustments that looked like fidgeting and were anything but. After a while, when the 5 were fed and the rhythm of the storm had found its second chorus, Mara spoke without lifting her eyes from the small jaw working against her skin. "They used to say I was a problem even before the girls," she said. "Too loud when I was quiet. Too much when I was small. They said I made trouble happen by standing where it could see me." Cal didn't look away from the panel. "You don't look at the sun when you can feel it on your face." They were wrong. The words didn't try to be comforting. They tried to be accurate. It worked better. 5 girls, she said, half laughing and half crying and doing neither. You should have seen their faces. Like I'd handed them a string of broken parts. "Nothing's broken here," he said. "Some things just need different instructions." She glanced up at him then, and he pretended to need the reactor readout for a full beat before admitting that eye contact was a thing 2 people could do without setting off an alarm. He rose, crossed to the portable nursery, lifted Sable, still the smallest, and rocked her with a patience that made the dome larger. The storm shoved at the walls and found them otherwise occupied. Hours stretched into the kind that usually happen only on ships and in waiting rooms. They ate bread and beans warmed over the induction plate and drank water that the dome made kinder than the world. Mara's hands trembled once, not because of fear but because they were no longer required to carry the day by themselves. Cal handed her the cup without looking. She took it without asking who it was for. When the worst of the first wave had spent itself, the wind dropped into a sulk. The silence that followed wasn't real, it was the kind machines make when they're thinking, but it was enough to make shapes out of the snow beyond the view slit. Cal stood at the slit long enough that Mara counted to 60 and back and then stopped counting and just watched him. He didn't open the door. He didn't reach for the rifle propped neatly against the frame. He just watched as if he could draw a map from the way the drift moved. "What do you see?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But I will." The second wave rolled in meaner, thinner, more personal. The dome arched its back and took it anyway. Mara fed, changed, rocked, hummed a song she didn't remember learning. Cal adjusted, checked, topped polyfuel, whispered curses that were too quiet to count against him. Sometime close to dawn, the kind of dawn that might just be the storm getting bored, Cal's shoulders tightened under his shirt. What? Mara said, fear standing up because it had been asked to sit too long. Shadows on the ridge, he said. 3. The old panic rose in her like someone had built stairs for it. The babies felt it, shifted, fretted. Cal didn't move from the slit. He didn't narrate more than he had to. They'll wait for the lull, he said. They'll think the storm is their friend. And is it? It's no one's friend, he said. But it gets drunk and forgets to hold grudges. When the wind dipped enough to let the air lie, the shapes resolved into men on hoverbikes, hunched against a cold that did not care what surnames they wore. Mara knew the cut of those shoulders before she knew the faces. Paul. Roy. And the old man who had taught them to say mine like a prayer. They dismounted, boots punching into the drift like threats written in snow. The outer cam caught their approach and gave the dome a view that made it feel like a person. Cal stood at the inner door, hand near the rifle but not on it. He didn't open the lock. He let them knock on the outside world first. Turner. The old man's voice tried to sound strong through the intercom and only managed loud. We've come for what's ours. You left them, Cal said, not bothering with a hello. They're not yours anymore. Blood says otherwise, Roy put in, because of course he did. Blood says a lot of things, Cal said. I hear the law better. Mara stepped up beside him then, the jacket heavy on her shoulders, iris tucked against her chest. Her bare feet remembered cold and didn't care. She didn't plan the words, they arrived ready to work. You can't have them, she said, looking at no one but looking at all of them. You left us at the landing pad. You do not get to decide anymore. Silence is a music. On the other side of the door, it played a bar that even the storm didn't interrupt. Roy's mouth forgot how to smirk. Paul looked at his boots and found nothing helpful there. The old man spat something the intercom declined to translate and then turned because there are fights you don't win against weather, walls, and the persons inside them. They trudged back to the bikes and let the storm take their outlines away. Cal didn't open the door to watch them go. He engaged the lock and then smoothed his palm over the seam as if that, too, was part of the mechanism. Mara's hands were shaking when she handed Iris to the nursery, not from fear but from the violence of relief. The babies took up the cry that had been postponed by adrenaline. Cal moved to the heater and fed it, because that is what you do when the world stops pretending to be gentle, you add heat. Why? She asked finally, the word not a challenge but a request for the blueprint. He looked at her long enough to be sure he meant it. Because no one should have to fight alone. She nodded once like a signature. Later, when the light bled through in a color that might have been gold somewhere else, Cal went to the bench and picked up the pencil again. He drew the curve he'd drawn yesterday and the day before. He wrote 5 names in the margin, Nova, Lyra, Iris, Wren, Sable, not like a list, but like a plan you can build. Mara threaded the needle and began a hem that would keep a child warmer than a town's opinion. Outside, the storm argued with itself. Inside, the dome agreed on something at last. Chapter 5, The Long Night Holds, and So Do We. The men were gone, but the storm had not spent its last word. It came back meaner, as if offended by the audacity of a locked door. The dome took the first punch without complaint. Metal thrummed, polyglass flexed, the air exchanger muttered a curse and cleared its throat. Cal listened with his hands, palm on the bulkhead, fingers on the magnetic index, and tuned a knob a quarter turn that made a sound Mara could not hear stop happening. Sleep if you can, he said. Mara looked at 5 answers to that suggestion lined up like small moons and smiled with half her mouth. I'll take the first watch, she said, and then amended, on them. He nodded like a man accepting a shift nobody scheduled. He placed the rifle back in its bracket, out of reach and in reach at once, then set a chair by the panel in a way that told the storm 2 people were on duty tonight. Hours stretch differently when a wall is working. The heater ticked wisdom, the reactor hummed patience. Mara fed Nova and then Lyra and then Ren, changing raps and murmuring nonsense that sounded like a language the babies had always known. Cal rotated polyfuel and recalculated the night. Every so often, he stood at the view slit and let his eyes adjust until white became a dozen shades of shape, and then a little more. What was her name? Mara asked when the quiet grew honest enough to hold something heavier. Your wife. Cal's gaze stayed on the numbers, not to avoid the past, but to hold both things at once. Elise, he said. She liked to race the drills. Said the planet moved faster when she laughed. What happened? The question was simple. It was also permission, if he wanted it. Seal failure on a service lock. The alarms didn't sound for 8 seconds. He didn't say how long 8 seconds is. I was at the panel. Close enough to hear the difference when the air left. Mara's hand tightened around Iris's wrap. I'm sorry. So am I, he said, and there was nothing noble about the way the words came out. I kept the dome. Couldn't keep the person. So I kept the things I could keep. He looked at the 5 small proofs that keeping isn't the same as owning. Turns out keeping people alive in a storm is the same skill set. Mara's laugh surprised both of them. It was small and bright and rolled once around the room before curling up near the heater. What did the town say? She asked. That I should have heard sooner. That I should have been closer. That I should have known a seal would fail because seals fail. He let the cruelty sit where it belonged, in other people's mouths. Then they ran out of suggestions and went back to work. Mara stroked Sable's cheek with a knuckle. They always have a list of what you should have done. None of it includes help. Another gust shouldered the dome, the antenna sang. Cal stood, listened. We'll get a lull, he said. Not long. Long enough. For what? To fix 2 things that will fail when they feel like it. He pointed at the vent tab that had been wobbly since a manufacturer who had never met this planet decided 2 screws meant stability. And to put a line out to Clara. Quietly. They waited the storm 3 more minutes, then 4. The wind dropped, as if bored. Cal tugged on his seal boots and handed Mara the mask with the good filter. He didn't say stay. She didn't pretend not to hear the word he didn't say. At the outer door, he looked at her once. If I go down, you leave me. I won't, she said, and the refusal was not bravery, it was arithmetic done differently. They let the airlock breathe them out. The cold bit to the bone instantly and with intent. Cal went for the vent tab like it owed him rent. The screwdriver didn't love his gloves, and he didn't love the speed the wind chose, but the screw seated, and the plate settled, and that corner of the world stopped trying to join the rest of the sky. Mara, meanwhile, banged the fuel cache flap hard enough to make it remember it was attached to something. She used her hip like a tool and her anger like a colleague. Snow found her ankles and made suggestions, she didn't take them. A faint whine came in under the storm, thin and curious. Mara's head snapped up. A micro-drone, slick, insect small, the kind of thing men who liked control liked to buy, skated the edge of the dome, sniffing for data. Cal saw it the same moment she did. He didn't have time for a clean solution. Inside, he said, and they ran the lock cycle brutal fast, heat billowing out and then sulking back as the door sealed. The drone tapped the polyglass like a nervous finger. Cal yanked open a cabinet, pulled a coil and a battery, and married them with a twist that promised at least 1 spark. Hold that, he said, and Mara did, bracing the coil while he bared 2 contacts and thought about Elise and 8 seconds and the ways a door can lie. He pulsed the EMP jolt. The lights hiccuped, the drone hiccuped harder. It stuttered, lost its lie, and fell into the drift like someone had finally told it the truth. They stood there grinning like thieves. It felt good to be rude to a thing that wanted to be rude first. Clara, Cal said, the plan back on its feet. He sealed the coil splice with tape, then slid into the chair and woke the tight beam to supply and fabrication. The storm makes most conversations impossible, tight beam whispers under the noise. He typed 3 words, Harlo probable return. Then, need witness/law line. Then, baby's okay, because if you don't put the headline where it belongs, people read the wrong story. Clara's reply came in a minute later, clipped and clean, copy. Law, abandonment community guardianship. Have logs. Come when sky turns human. Law. Mara asked. On colonies, if someone leaves a person to die, the one who keeps them alive gets first say, Cal said. It's messy until it isn't. Mara nodded once. The storm found its breath again and tried to shove the dome off its principles. It failed. They made tea with water that had been ice in the recent religion of outside. Cal showed Mara the inner lock override again until she could do it eyes closed, hands busy, baby crying. She showed him how to swaddle in a way that made Ren stop doing the octopus thing and agree to be a mammal. He failed twice, then succeeded once, and took the victory like a man who had not been given many lately. Closer to dawn, when the sky remembered there were other colors, the storm dropped into the old man grumble that means it is leaving whether it wants to or not. The dome stopped bracing and started exhaling. Mara stood at the view slit and watched the wind comb the drift smooth. The tracks the men had left were gone, either by weather or by mercy. We'll have to go into town, she said. Cal nodded. We'll bring the logs. We'll bring you. She turned. You keep saying we. It's a good word, he said. Stays warm longer. She didn't cry. That belonged to another life. But something inside her that had been standing since she could remember finally sat down. They slept for an hour before the day learned their names again. When they woke, the dome was the size of a house and not the size of a hand. Cal brewed coffee that tasted like someone had argued with beans and won. Mara laughed again, bigger this time. The babies took turns being miracles in sequence. The storm left, muttering, and the sky pretended it had always intended to be a gentle thing. Today, Cal said, we build cradles. Today, Mara said, we call them by their names. They said them together, Nova, Lyra, Iris, Ren, Sable, and the dome listened like a witness. Outside, the light forgave the horizon for being far. Chapter 6, The Names on the Wood and the Sky Turning Human. The day after a storm has 2 jobs, make the world look innocent and make you soar. It did both. Cal took a pry bar to the ice lip on the air intake and cursed softly in a dialect only vents understand. Mara hauled the drift away from the hatch lip with a shovel that had learned its shape the hard way. She wore his jacket and a strip of muslin in her hair. He wore a new line between his brows that meant good tired. Inside, the dome looked like a place people lived on purpose. The printer chimed that it would like attention and filament, the nursery hummed that it would like to keep 5 planets in orbit, the heater suggested polyfuel with the courtesy of a host. Cal fed the printer with composite and bioresin, then loaded a profile he'd been tinkering with since before anyone else knew what it was for. The build plate warmed, the nozzle nodded, the first curve of a cradle grew out of nothing because someone had told it to. Mara watched the shape become truth, hands threaded and still. You make it look easy, she said. It's all hard the first 10 times, he said. After that it's maintenance and pretending you planned it. She laughed, then bent over Lyra to adjust a wrap and kiss a forehead that didn't yet know how to frown. The printer hiccuped. Cal glanced over and saw the nozzle gather a blister of resin. Hold on, he said, and reached for the cleaning tool. Needle, Mara said, already pulling one from her packet. Smaller. Less angry. He took it, cleared the clog with a surgeon's care and a mechanic's speed, then held the needle up like a treaty. Your tools, he said. My hands. Our cradle, she corrected, and the word fit the room. They printed 5 in pieces, bases, sides, the little arcs that make rocking look like breathing. Cal post-cured the resin under the UV lamp until the parts stopped pretending to be soft. Mara sanded edges silk smooth with a patience that was not infinite but was well trained. The printer head moved back and forth, drawing names in a careful font along each cradle's footboard: Nova, Lyra, Iris, Wren, Sable. Cal's hand didn't shake. Mara's did, but in the way of someone whose muscles are catching up to the truth. They assembled the first with an argument between a screw and a hole that resolved into agreement. Cal tightened the last brace, sat back on his heels, and let the ridiculous sight of it, a thing to hold a human on purpose, have him for a full breath. Mara traced Nova with a fingertip. "Hello," she whispered, as if meeting a person with that name for the first time and finding her already beloved. They worked in a rhythm that made the day round. Feed 2, bolt 3 pieces, burp 1, clamp a seam, check the reactor, swap polyfuel, rock a cradle with a toe while sanding another with a hand. It was logistics, and it was devotion, and it was what a future looks like when it is not trying to impress anyone. Around noon, the tight beam ticked once. "Clara, sky human enough. Bring logs. Commissioner at shop." Then, after a breath, "Bring them all or bring the story. Your choice." Cal looked at the window where the light had learned to be honest again. He looked at the 5 and at Mara. "We should go," he said. "If you want to." "Do you?" she asked. "I want it written down," he said. "So the next time someone thinks they can knock and undo a life, they have to trip over paperwork." Mara smiled with her whole mouth this time. "Paperwork is a kind of wall." They dressed for town in layers and resolve. The portable nursery took 4. Sable rode in a new sling across Mara's chest, small and indignant about the indignity of existing. Cal strapped the nursery in, checked the seals, and checked them again because grief had taught him to count too often. The road to Ridge Hollow had been ironed by wind, the crawler found its tracks and made them truer. The outpost looked smaller after a storm, like a child who has been scolded and is trying to look innocent. Inside supply and fabrication, Clara had turned the counter into a desk that wanted to be a bench. A commissioner, the kind of woman who files her hair in the same drawer as her statutes, waited with a slate and a face that remembered fairness long enough to practice it. "You Turner?" she asked. "Cal," he said. "And you're Mara Harlo." The commissioner's eyes took in the bruise that was now a history lesson, the babies, the way the room edged closer to them without admitting it. "You understand why we make records? So memory doesn't get edited by the loudest voice," Mara said. That earned a real nod. "Good answer." She tapped the slate awake. "Let's be official. On Wyoming-λ, under Colonial Statute 9, abandonment and rescue, any person left in mortal peril and then sustained by a resident falls under community guardianship, provisional to review. Blood can petition. The guardian can refuse. Safety decides." "We refuse," Cal said, and the 2 words fit in his mouth like they had been there for years waiting to come out. "Accepted," the commissioner said. "Do you have logs?" Cal slid a data stick across, outer cam, air readings, the time-stamped tight beam to Clara. Clara placed a hand on the counter in an unremarkable way that meant witness. 2 miners from the yard wandered in on purpose and discovered ink on their fingers. The cantina owner came to buy sealant he didn't need. Everyone had a chore that put them near the counter at the right time. The commissioner looked up once. "You'll take heat for this," she said, not as a warning, just as a weather report. "I've got a dome," Cal said. "We're used to heat." "Good," she said. She added a note that had nothing to do with statutes: community consensus leans protective. Roy did not appear. The old man did not, either. The room felt their absence like a pressure drop. Paper, or the slate that pretended to be it, was a wall, and the town had just added bricks. On the way out, Clara stopped them with an unlabeled jar. "Molasses," she said, deadpan. "If you call it a gift, I'll charge double." Mara took it like a secret and tucked it deep. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than sugar. Clara nodded once, slow, as if agreeing to guard a gate no one else knew was there. The ride home was different. The crawler's engine sounded less like effort and more like intention. The horizon felt less like a dare and more like a line a person could draw a house against. Back at the dome, they finished the cradles. 5 in a row made the room look like a plan and not a scramble. Cal carried Wren to hers, laid her down, and watched her consider whether to complain. She didn't. She went to sleep like someone who had just discovered a better idea. Mara moved from cradle to cradle, laying a finger on each engraved name. "You live here," she said to Nova. "You belong here," she said to Lyra. "You are wanted," she told Iris. "You are not a problem," she told Wren. "You are not last," she promised Sable. Cal leaned against the workbench and let the world rearrange around the shape of those sentences. "We should celebrate," he said, then looked at the shelf and found that celebration on this planet looked like bread with molasses so thin it thought about sweetness and then committed. They ate standing up. It tasted like a place deciding to keep you. Night came gentle for once. The ion shards still cut along the horizon, a reminder that weather has moods, not plans. Cal checked the latch twice out of habit and then a third time for Elise and then a fourth time for the babies and then stopped counting because there's a point past which you hand the job to faith or exhaustion. He climbed the ladder to the loft, paused halfway, and looked down at the room, 5 cradles in a row like a cord, Mara on the lower bunk with a book Clara had slipped into the fabric like contraband wisdom, the heater humming an old song. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said back, and the shape of the words in the dome felt like architecture. They slept, because bodies forgive when they are allowed. The ridge net pinged once just before midnight, an automated petition received note, sterile as a dental tool. Cal saw it on the panel and let it sit until morning. Paperwork is a wall, yes. It is also a hammer if you know where the nails are. Outside, the sky kept pretending it had never been otherwise. Inside, 6 people and a dome believed it. Tomorrow would bring a statute to argue and a family to decline and a town to test itself against its own idea of fairness. But tonight, there were 5 names on wood, and 2 names on a promise, and a storm that had gone to sleep somewhere else. The universe is large. A cradle is small. Sometimes that's exactly how you win. Chapter 7, Statutes, Stones, and the Shape of We. The morning memo on the ridge net was the kind you never want and always need. Petition received, Harlo family asserts claim. Hearing, 1,300 hours, Outpost Hall. Bureaucracy doesn't have a smell, but on Wyoming-λ it always felt faintly of kerosene and cold metal. Cal read it twice and then looked over the rail of the loft to where 5 names on wood caught the light, Nova, Lyra, Iris, Wren, Sable, and where Mara sat with a slate on her knees, typing the shorthand of a life, ounces fed, minutes slept, a note that Wren liked to hold her own ear. "Today," he said. "Today," she echoed, with the quiet a person uses when lining up a shot. They prepared like people who know storms, not loud, not frantic, just thorough. Cal packed the outer cam logs, the landing pad telemetry Clara had scraped from a sulky sensor, a clip of the microdrone falling out of the sky because honesty met a coil. He printed 2 extra copies, because printers behave when they are watched. Mara changed the girls into the soft muslin wraps she had cut and hemmed and made real. She tucked Sable against her chest in a new sling and kissed each forehead in turn. There are rituals that look small and keep planets aligned. You don't have to come, Cal said, because the truth sometimes needs to be offered even when it will be declined. I do, Mara said, not bothering to make it brave. I left them once when someone told me to. I won't again when they ask. The road to Ridge Hollow had gone glassy under a day of sunlight that had learned modesty. The crawler's treads whispered. The sky looked like it had slept and wasn't ready for company. Cal drove with his usual competence and his unusual habit of checking the mirror to count small chests rising and falling. The outpost hall had been a salvage bay before it decided to be a courthouse on Sundays and a dance floor on the brave ones. Today it was chairs, a table, a commissioner with a face that could carry 10 laws without listing, and a community that arrived all at once and then pretended it hadn't planned it. The Harlo party came late, as if tardiness could tilt the scales, Paul in a coat that had learned him badly, Roy with a new toothpick in the same old mouth, and the old man, a retained advocate in tow, slick, planetary, wearing gravity like a custom suit. The commissioner opened with a voice that could quarry stone. Statute 9. Abandonment and rescue. We'll hear claims, show logs, and let safety make the last word. Blood speaks, but it doesn't shout anyone else down. The advocate stood. He had the kind of accent that came free with a certain kind of education. My clients, he said, acknowledge a misunderstanding. They acted in haste. They wish to correct the record and reassert familial guardianship over the minors. The mother, of course, returns with them. Blood is not a technicality. Blood left her on a landing pad in a whiteout, Clara said, from the second row where she had not been asked to speak. Log says so. My eyes do too. The room didn't laugh. It did agree. Cal set the data stick on the table. Outer cam, he said. Time-stamped. The screen showed the shuttle lifting, the snow strafing, the bench with a woman on it trying to be smaller than physics allows. Then Cal's crawler arrived, the jacket, the portable nursery winking amber like a hearth that had learned LEDs. There was no sound, which was fine, everyone in Ridge Hollow knew what that day sounded like. The advocate tried a smile that had sold worse ideas. Mr. Turner, are we to understand you acted out of charity? Commendable. The law recognizes temporary safekeeping under extreme conditions. It does not remove custody. Temporary ends when the danger does, the commissioner said. This danger didn't. It walked and sat and slept beside them. It still does. Mara stood then. Not because they asked, no one had, but because a room will tilt until the right weight stands where it belongs. They told me to wait, she said. No adornment. They called 5 girls a curse. They hit me for it. They left. He found us. He said we. The old man's mouth made a shape a storm could have blown through. The advocate lifted a hand as if balancing a tray. The Harlo name is a weather report, not a verdict, the commissioner said. Statute 9 shifts guardianship when abandonment in mortal peril occurs. It grants community guardianship to the rescuer, provisional to review. It recognizes the agency of the adult involved. She looked at Mara. You choose. Mara had the sling strap in her hand like a line she could pull the world along with. I choose to stay, she said. I choose us. I choose the people who stood between my daughters and the storm when no one else did. The commissioner tapped the slate. The sound went through the room like a nail seating. Recorded. Roy uncrossed his arms to make a fist of his posture. You can't just. Can, said one of the miners, Jax, with polymer grease under his nails and a witness stamp already on his finger. Saw the pad that day. Saw the storm. If you wanted to keep what you say was yours, you shouldn't have thrown it at space. The advocate pivoted. Then at least the mother returns. The miners follow upon petition resolution. Compromise. Compromise, Clara said, is not lingo for kidnapping the woman. Something in the air changed. Not drama, just density. People leaned forward a millimeter. It looked like nothing and was not. The commissioner didn't sigh because she had trained it out of herself. Mara Harlo is a person, not a conveyance, she said. She is safe where she is and chooses to remain. Guardianship of the minors is vested provisionally with Mr. Turner under community oversight. Petition for review is accepted but will be scheduled when the sky cooperates. Until then, approach the dome and you approach the town. The old man looked at the advocate, and for the first time the advocate looked old. Roy opened his mouth and found no words inside. Paul, who had been studying his boots like they might help, lifted his head and surprised the room by looking ashamed for one whole blink. They left without a scene. They left like weather that had realized it wasn't the only forecast. When the door latched, the room exhaled. The commissioner signed the slate with a stylist that had outlived 2 stints and 1 marriage. "Mr. Turner," she said, voice softened but unsweetened, "guardianship means help at 0300 and witnesses at 1300. Ask for both." Cal inclined his head. "We know the hour." Back at the dome, the world rearranged itself around the new wall of paperwork and the old wall of choices. Cal reinforced the EM mesh over the view slit. Mara practiced with the stun rifle at minimum setting, cursing the sights until they agreed with her eyes. He ran the babies through the evening feed rotation and pretended not to watch her because he didn't have to pretend anymore. It was beautiful and true. Belonging, Mara said that night, the word like a handful of river stones. It felt like a trick before. Like something people said to excuse chains. Today it felt like a room with windows. Cal considered the word the way he considered load paths. Belonging, he said, is when you can leave and don't. She stood on tiptoe to put her mouth against his cheek, a kiss so light it might have been a change in air pressure. He closed his eyes the way a man does when he learns an old injury is finally mending. Outside, the ridge held its breath like a thing that had just remembered silence. Inside, 5 cradles rocked in different tempos, the microreactor purred, and the dome slept with one ear open because that's how you keep a home up. Tomorrow would collect its due, storms do and so do families. But tonight the ledger was kind. Tonight the word we fit in both their mouths. Chapter 8, the door, the ring, and the witnesses we choose. They made it 3 quiet days before the Harlo name tried one last time to be the loudest sound. It was morning that thought it was evening, the light weird with ion haze. Cal was taking apart the air exchanger with the pleasure of a man untying a knot when the ridge net spat a ping that meant approach. 2 signatures, bikes with board mufflers and a third, smaller blip, another microdrone testing the perimeter like a tooth on a bruise. Cal didn't reach for the rifle. He reached for the tight beam. To Hull, approach at dome. 2 riders plus drone. Statute 9 in force. Clara's reply was 3 words and an entire plan, on our way. He turned to Mara. She was already wrapping Iris tighter, tucking Nova a shade deeper and kissing Sable in the place babies keep courage. "Inside," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. And loud. They stood at the inner door and let the outer cam send them the show. Roy and Paul dismounted like they'd meant to be seen doing it. The drone buzzed a smug circle and caught a flicker of Clara's truck in the distance, which is to say it caught its own ending. "Turner." Roy shouted to the mic they all pretend isn't there. "Open up. We've got a writ." "Show it to the cam," Cal said. The paper, real paper, because some men think pulp carries more threat than pixels, flapped in the wind. It said words, none of them were law here and none of them mattered to people who read Statute 9 as scripture. "We don't answer to Clara," Roy sneered when the truck finally rolled into view. "Or your little shop court. You answer to weather and witnesses," Clara said, climbing down with the commissioner and 2 miners who had found errands midway through their lunch. "Lucky for you, we brought both." Paul looked smaller up close. He kept glancing at the cradles visible through the polyglass and then forcing his eyes back to the door like they'd misbehaved. Roy stepped closer, hand lifting to bang the airlock with the flat confidence of a person who's never broken their own knuckles. Mara stepped into the cam's field, stun rifle at her shoulder, not pointed, just present. She said 8 words that landed like a fence post: "You do not get to touch us." Roy made the mistake anger makes, he moved without thinking. The drone zipped, camera tilting, as if that could catch a better angle on a bad idea. The air listened, which is to say it waited to be told who it was. Cal opened the first seal of the lock, not to let them in, but to let his voice out clean. "Under Statute 9 and yesterday's record, approach is trespass. Step back. Roy smirked the way people smirk when they can't invent a better expression. What are you going to do if I don't? Print another cradle? We'll print a town, if that's what it takes, Clara said, stepping onto the porch with the commissioner at her shoulder, Slate already awake. And you'll pay a fine you can't afford and wear a band that keeps you off every roof with a heater under it. The wind gave up trying to be interesting and went quiet so the room could hear itself. Paul found his voice. It wasn't brave, but it was new. Roy, he said, not looking at the camera. Let's go. Roy barked a laugh that didn't bark back. We don't. We do, Paul said, and the two words were the whole Harlo history cracking down the middle. He turned, mounted, and waited. Eventually even a man like Roy knows when the audience has left. He cursed, spit, and followed. The drone hung a second longer, indecisive as a child at bedtime. The commissioner raised an eyebrow at it like a teacher at a test. It reconsidered its life and zipped away. Clara didn't smile. She looked at the cam, at the door, at the road, and let her shoulders come down a notch. I brought bread, she said, because someone had to reset the story from fight to home. They ate standing up in the entry, because landmarks should be fed too. The commissioner signed the trespass notice into the ledger without ceremony. The miners stood in the yard and looked like statues until the horizon remembered how to be empty. Then the witnesses drifted back to jobs that would not do themselves. When the door closed and the lock seated, the dome changed key. Something had ended, not the threat, not the family, not the weather, but the idea that loud could undo true. The afternoon took on the shape of peace that has nowhere better to be. Cal fixed the air exchanger, just to let his hands tell his nerves a story they already knew. Mara curled on the lower bunk with Iris against her chest and the other four within toe-rocking range, and for a long time she simply watched them exist. Near evening, when the light turned the drifts into sheets of hammered metal, Cal came in from the bench with something small in his palm. Not shine, sheen. Not new, renewed. I took this off the spare O2 valve, he said, a little shy suddenly, which made him bigger. It used to stop a leak. I filed it down to promise. It's not about owing. It's about staying. If you want it. The ring was a thin silver circle, the ghost of a hex where a wrench once fit, polished to a soft moonlight. It looked like something that had done real work and wanted to do more. Mara didn't reach for it immediately. She reached for his wrist, steadying the hand that offered it, because sometimes the trembling belongs to the person who is finally allowed to ask. She laughed once, delighted, disbelieving. A valve ring, she said. So we remember to breathe. So we choose to, he said. Yes, she said, and put out her left hand because some rituals are old for good reasons. He slid the ring on, and the dome heard it in the way good rooms do. Nothing changed, and everything did. She rose on her toes and kissed him, not on the cheek this time but where vows go when they don't need altars. They stepped onto the porch because the world deserved to see itself be kinder. The sky had finally decided to be sky, laced with green aurora like stitches in the night. The cradles inside rocked on after small winds. The ridge held still, the town a quiet underscore. Out there, someone would say the words petition denied and mean it. In here, two people had already done the paperwork that counts. Mara held up her hand and squinted at the ring. We'll have to tell them a story one day, she said, nodding toward 5 futures. We will, Cal said. We'll tell them the version where people are the technology that mattered. The HFY version, she said, grinning. The only one that lasts, he said. They stood until the cold suggested soup. They went in without arguing. The airlock closed with that soft certainty good machines learn from good homes. The aurora stitched another seam. The babies breathed in their 5-part harmony. And if you've walked with them to this door and want to put your witness mark on the ledger they're building, add your voice to this little outpost, tap like, subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula, and leave a one-line blessing for their new home so the story stays warm.